seated. It's such a privilege to be here this evening to join in this wonderful event, the inaugural lecture of Prof. Fiona Anciano. Welcome to our DVC research, Prof. France, to the leaders from the other faculties, to our colleagues in EMS, and our students, and importantly, Fiona's family and friends. We share this event with you. An inaugural lecture is really such an old academic tradition. It's your rite of passage. It's your way, it's your promotion to full professorship, and it's a way to show not only for you your personal milestone, but also for the university community, to showcase your scholarship and your contribution to society. So I'm so looking forward to sharing your journey this evening, to hear the stories. And without further ado, I'm going to ask our DVC, Prof. France, to do the official welcomes.
Thank you so much, Prof. Wow, this is a celebration. Everybody looks so serious. That's better. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this inaugural lecture here this evening. We are excited to hear what Prof. Anciano has to say to us. So on behalf of our Rector and Vice-Chancellor, Prof. Balfour, I want to wish you a hearty welcome to this inaugural lecture. It is both an honor and a privilege to welcome you here. This inaugural lecture is a tradition that holds deep meaning in the life of any university. Inaugural lectures are more than ceremonial occasions. They serve as a moment to celebrate the academic journey of a scholar who has attained the rank of professor, to showcase the depth of their scholarship, and to publicly affirm the contributions they are making to knowledge, society, and the mission of the university. At UWC, inaugural lectures embody three key purposes. They affirm the university's commitment to intellectual excellence and critical inquiry. They provide a platform for scholars to share their research with a wider community, bridging the gap between academia and society. And they mark a milestone in a scholar's career, while also inspiring the next generation of students and researchers to pursue knowledge that transforms lives. So, ladies and gentlemen, inaugural lectures remind us that universities do not simply transmit knowledge. They create it, they challenge it, and they use it to transform society. So this evening, Prof. Anciano's work is a shining example of that mission in action. So I want you to be welcome and enjoy the engaging lecture that's going to follow. I thank you.
Thanks, Prof. France. Now I'm going to ask our Dean, Prof. Michelle Iso, to introduce our inaugural lecturer, Prof. Anciano. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Professor Vandenberg. Good evening, DVC. To our special guest of honor, Professor Anciano. I see her family, her husband, her two beautiful daughters, and I'm also told that her parents are here and a number of other members of her family. And then to all my colleagues and also to our students here this evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Fiona to you. Fiona is a professor in the Department of Political Studies and holds a UWC-funded chair in citizenship and democracy. She's the head of the Politics and Urban Governance Research Group in our faculty and a visiting researcher at University West, Sweden. She previously held the positions of Deputy Dean of Learning and Teaching and Acting Deputy Dean of Research in the EMS faculty, always willing to support leadership in whichever way she is able to. She is a qualitative researcher specializing in participatory action research methods with an interest in urban governance, democratization, and civil society. Working with global teams, Fiona has secured over 20 grants supporting comparative urban research and capacity building for early career researchers. She is a cluster co-chair of the Global Participedia Network and an advisory board member of and active collaborator with the UNESCO Chair on the protection of human rights defenders and expansion of political space. Fiona has produced numerous publications, including the co-authored book Democracy Disconnected, Participation and Governance in a City of the South, published by Routledge, United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Bring it up a bit. It's always a thing with the adjusting the, but I think this will be right for you as well. I'm going to ask Our Lady of the Moment to please join us for the inaugural lecture. Where are you? Fiona, there you are.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I am waiting for my slides. By magic, somebody turn up. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us here this evening, and a really warm thanks to those who've had to travel across the city. It's not always easy to get here. And also those students who've come during recess. For some of you may not know, this is not term time, so it's very quiet on campus. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between how cities are governed and this concept we live under of democracy. I'm going to begin by sharing a little bit about my own journey to how I became a professor and ended up doing this research. And then I'll share some examples of the research I've conducted with many people over the last 20 years. And my aim is not just to share these findings, but to do some reflection as well. And I also hope to spark a conversation, because I want us to think about the question of who holds power to shape the city we live in. And how does this work, particularly when citizens feel increasingly disconnected from the outcome of formal democratic systems? So my research is a product of its time. It's shaped by the era into which I was born, and my worldview and what I've carried into academia is really inseparable from history. I was born in the year after the Soweto uprisings in 1977. Oh, I just gave my age away. And I attended a racially segregated government school in the 1980s. And while I definitely had a privileged upbringing, we were still exposed and experienced things like bomb drills, where you had to hide under your desk. And that was part and parcel of living and growing up under an apartheid state of emergency. But by 1990, when I turned 13, which I think is a formative age for any young person, well, my husband's a psychologist, he tells me that, it's an important age. And at 13, when I was 13, our country entered into a democratic spring. And I think it was within the spring that I discovered my passion for political studies. You know, I look back and I found this picture the other day in an old trunk, and it struck me so profoundly that there I was with the title, The Face of the Future, this group of children. So I was part of a small group who, in grade 7 now, I was in grade 7, who joined an exchange program between lower income schools in Soweto and our privileged whites-only school. And we felt the promise of hope, a group of people like this, an excitement to know we weren't all that different from each other, and a sense of responsibility, I think, to build a common future. Yeah, when there is that title, The Face of the Future, on your magazine cover, and you're 13, you think, I better do something about this, right? But I carry this memory with me, and I think it's stayed with me all my life, because it certainly was with me when I went to university at the University of Pietermaritzburg. And I did a degree there majoring in political studies and in law. Of course, I was meant to study in LLB because I had to earn a living, and who studies politics to get a job? But I couldn't quite resist going to the politics classes and ended up doing an honors, and yeah, the rest was history. At the end of that year of my honors, so the students in here, guys, you can get a job if you study honors, okay? So at the end of that year, I went to London, and with the help of the department and the lovely motivation from them, I got a scholarship to study at the School of the Oriental and African Studies, and I enjoyed that master's, but it was very academic and a little bit abstract. So I wanted to come back to South Africa and continue to work in research. So I returned to the Center for Policy Studies, or returned there to Johannesburg and worked at the Center for Policy Studies. And it was at the center where I learned very quickly about the world of grant funding, project deadlines, policy influence. I was fortunate to be mentored by the fierce intellect of Stephen Friedman, and he set a very high bar for what ethical policy research should look like. But he also introduced me to the world of donors and officials. And so I learned a little bit about what it means to run a research organization and how that works. In 2003, I got married and returned to London for what I thought I had negotiated with my husband to be just 2 years, but turns out a bit longer than that. So I had to find a job, and I really wanted to work in international development. It just sounded fun, right? But I couldn't find a job. I didn't have the right networks, and I didn't really have enough experience. And every rejection at the interviews, they'd tell me, if you just had a PhD, we could have employed you. Now I know that that's just what you say to someone to make them not feel bad. But I took it very seriously, so I went and did a PhD, right? But that's fate, because it was the best decision I ever made. After marrying you, of course. No, it was the best decision I ever made. Because I then got to go and study at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And I actually had a PhD office shared with other people in the same room that L.B. Sachs wrote a draft of our Constitution. So it was a wonderful space to be in and quite inspiring. In my PhD research, I focused on the relationship between social movements as agents of civil society and democracy in post-apartheid South Africa. I wanted to understand how social movements could help the state be more accountable in terms of service delivery. And to do this, I worked with the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee in Johannesburg and with a women-led trade union movement called Sekula Sonke, which were based in the winelands of Stellenbosch. I absolutely fell in love with fieldwork and research. It was complicated, it was time-consuming, it was emotionally challenging. Yeah, I know I feel like I'm talking to my students, but we all love it, right? It also made me feel quite discomforted because I had to learn and watch and listen and question and feel out of place because I was in parts and with people of my country I'd never known before. But I did realize that this was the passion I had. I wanted to be a researcher. In terms of my actual findings, my key takeaway from my PhD was that democracy as an ideal, and to a large extent as a practice, was really thriving in South Africa. Social movements were keeping democratic spaces open. The government was tolerant of a diversity of views. Of course, I realized that this was most effective when you would have non-state actors, like social movements, that employed a term I called the moderate flank effect. They would protest and they would threaten instability on the one hand, they'd show a radical flank, but on the other hand, behind the scenes, they'd offer an open door and there was discussion and often consensus building. After my PhD, and what turned out to be nearly 5 years in London, I returned for a brief period to the Center for Policy Studies back there. Our 2 children were born in Johannesburg, and I stepped back from full-time work for a few years. But I did some part-time consultancy, and I worked at the Ahmed Kathadra Foundation. And there I looked at this question of non-racialism. It was really interesting because I got, obviously the foundation was very well connected with some, quite senior politicians. So I got to interview a lot of interesting people from Thabo Mbeki. I was pregnant, by the way. I just had a big lunch. Thabo Mbeki and Helen Ziller, a whole lot of very interesting people. And I also started to realize how policy making actually works and what do politicians really do. went to meet a lot of who are now ANC ministers, interviewed them. I even interviewed who was the head of the ANC Youth League and subsequently became a minister. So it was very interesting to see what they said then and where they've gone in their journey. As part of this work, I also spent time talking to young ANC branch members from Sandton to Soweto. I went to many, many branches, and it was fascinating to learn how branches actually work in reality in relation to the ANC's headquarters. It did highlight for me deep-seated concerns about local party democracy, because it revealed at that point, and this was 15, 20 years ago, a party really fractured at the grassroots. And for me, raised a lot of questions about where may the ANC be going in the future. At that time, I was also teaching at the University of Wits, and that's when I realized I love teaching. In 2012, we moved to Cape Town, and my aspiration was now to find an academic job. I'd realized that I loved teaching, it was my heart was, and actually I then remembered a conversation I had with my stepdad, Pete, who's here today, one day in a car. You know when they're 10 and they say to you, what do you want to do? And we were discussing what I had to put on my picture about what I want to do when I grow up. And I remember saying, well, I really, really want to teach, but I don't want to teach children. They're just a bit, irritating. So he said, well, you're going to have to be a professor then. And I do remember thinking, okay, I don't know what that is, but I'll have to be a professor. And so that conversation came back to me because here I am. So when we arrived in Cape Town, my old lecturer from Pietermaritzburg, who I had always thought was very old, but turns out he wasn't. He was just a few years older than me at the time. When you see a lecturer, you think, wow, if only I could be like that. And actually, it's not unachievable. He was at UWC, and he said to me, come and do some contract teaching. We'll see how it goes. And it went well. And ultimately, I got a lecturing post at the university when an opportunity arose. And that's when I realized I had found my home. And I absolutely just loved teaching at UWC. And the thing I love the most, and I still love the most, is large first-year classes where you've got hundreds of students and we talk about theories of power, and together we interrogate questions of race and class and gender, corruption, democracy, etc. And I used to run up and down the auditorium, well, I still do now, but I have to wear tackies, with a microphone. And at times it would really feel as though I was hosting a political version of the Jerry Springer show. But it was a great, space to really engage. From a research perspective, after I arrived at UWC, I became intrigued with this idea of clientelism. Now, clientelism is a political practice in which leaders, patrons, or political parties provide material benefits. They give jobs or money or resources to services and individuals in exchange for political loyalty. And this was at a time when the notion of state capture was entering our national discourse. But nobody was really talking about what this might look like at the very local level, in local neighborhoods. And so I got a UWC small research grant. Yes, they make a big difference, those grants. It took me a long way. And I did some preliminary research into clientelistic relationships in Hout Bay. I spent time talking to politicians, as well as residents of this particular neighborhood called Hungberg. And sitting in the homes of poachers or protest fishers taught me more about South African politics than weeks behind a desk. Although I did have to learn how to maintain my focus when the joints were passed around me a lot. Had to take quick field notes. This research was then funded through a full Tutuka NRF grant, which allowed me to continue. And actually, I've been very grateful to the NRF. We complain about our research bodies sometimes, but really they've supported my research for many years, and I am grateful for the funding we get. Ultimately, what I found in this research was that at the very local scale, patronage politics can actually be quite similar to democratic politics in some ways. Because what clients do is they say to their patron, I'll support you, but you've got to give me what I need. And that's what we do when we vote for the political parties. I'll support you, but in return, I actually want some kind of resources back. So at the very local level, I thought we should start thinking about clientelism in slightly different ways and understand that that's a conscious political strategy by clients to get development. I mean, by no means am I saying clientelism or patronage is a solution to democracy's deficits, but this work came at a time where I really started thinking about what does decolonization mean? And for me, this is what a decolonized approach is. We need to meet citizens where they're at, with the actual lived experiences that they're going through. Rather than demonizing all practices that we're told is bad, actually how do people need to navigate and negotiate the state? And we can't just use imposed Western norms that come from Western democracies from very different contexts and put them onto our system and make judgments that way. But what this research then also started to show me is that people were not actually happy with the democratic system, and they weren't happy with its practice and its outcomes. Now, today, talking about democracy being in crisis is not unusual. We hear that all the time in the media, certainly in the research we do. But this was, only 10 years after 1994. This was not a good thing to hear at the time. It seemed too soon that actually democracy shouldn't be failing yet. So it was a troubling finding. And it prompted my colleague and I, Lawrence Piper, to write this book called Democracy Disconnected. And what we did is we went back to Hout Bay and we asked these questions. What forms of governance do citizens actually experience on a day-to-day basis? And we then conducted over 50 interviews with a range of different actors across this tiny part of our city. And why Hout Bay? Because Hout Bay is a really diverse place. It's got multiple different types of housing, different kinds of economic, wealthy, poor. It's also a place that's had a lot of conflicts. Hout Bayans thrive on having a good argument about different things. Should we build a toll road? Shouldn't we? Should someone sell the mountain? Shouldn't they? So we found that actually we could start to research conflicts and understand why they happen and what that told us about power, democracy, and governance. We looked at how the river Disa River was cleaned or wasn't cleaned and who was governing that. We explored the idea of the Sentinel Mountain, and somebody said at one point it was going to be sold to Oprah Winfrey. What did that even mean, and why was that process there? We wrote chapters looking at people who had been evicted from the sides of the Sentinel Mountain because they posed a fire risk. We looked at poaching the bay. What happens when fisherfolk have to become smugglers because the livelihood that they've relied on for decades, even hundreds of years, in their small village, where it used to be a small fishing village, is no longer deemed legitimate. We had a look at what happens when a fire breaks out and what happens around land, and I'll say more about that later. And then we also looked at taxis and taxi violence, which at the time was a relatively new area. And a number of times I got contacted by the news to talk about taxi violence as the expert, and really I was not. But it's because very few people at the time understood what was going on. So we looked at that too. We tried to understand why was there a protest about putting up the toll road that links a node hook to Hout Bay. And finally, and the work I did that I found most interesting at the time was who provides safety for people who live in Hout Bay, and how very different it was if you lived in the wealthy valley, in Mozamoyetu, the township, or Hangburg. And so that was fascinating because it really gave me insight into what everyday governance of a very important part of your life means, just staying safe. We developed a model from this that we called the FUG. It was our nickname, but I still use it in my head all the time, which basically meant a framework of urban governance. How do we put this into a framework and a model? Political scientists love models. I will just disclose that. They're not always that useful, but it's how we like to teach. So we create templates and frameworks and matrices. And we tried to do that for comparative reasons. And one of the other things we were able to do is we could show that politics, democracy, and governance are all a cyclical process. But when we think of governance, we've got to think of it in 5 different ways. Bureaucratic, what officials do. Market, what the capitalist market does when it comes to buying and selling. Developmental projects. Network governance, who talks to who and how does that lead to who's in control. And then informal governance, that often invisible committees, very local level structures. The book was a springboard for what continued to be my abiding research interest. And that's this question. How does urban governance actually function? Who holds the power to shape the city when citizens are increasingly disconnected from formal processes? And so to address this question, I have now been involved in many, probably over 10 projects, local and international projects that really focus on this topic. I've mostly worked in informal settlements as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm just going to choose a couple of examples and some cases to discuss in two different themes. The one is going to be about crisis, and the other will be about service delivery, to try and unpack this question of who governs and how do they do it. So here is a picture of Imizamo Yetu. What happens to residents in a city during a crisis, particularly when we see something like this, where in March 2017, a fire ravaged through Hout Bay settlement. Over 2,000 structures were destroyed and nearly 10,000 people were displaced overnight. A year or so after this fire, a colleague, S.J. Cooper-Knock, and we started to talk to community leaders and residents in Imizamo Yetu to understand how had they responded in real time during the fire, the day after the fire, and the weeks after the fire. What do you do where you live and everything you know has burnt down? In the immediate aftermath of the fire, what had happened practically was that the city of Cape Town had come to Imizamo Yetu because they needed a framework to guide how will they give shelter, how will they give clothing, food, and care for those who were displaced. They had to really then, most importantly, decide, what do we do with this empty land? And they felt that this was a good time to rebuild. To facilitate the process of what was going to happen immediately, over 10 local committees in IY came together, and they formed an umbrella body called the IY Forum. And I had worked with and known a lot about the individual committees, so it was interesting to see what happens when they all came together to deal with a crisis like this. But simultaneous to that, the city decided now was a good chance to rebuild the settlement. So you can see the damaged area. And the idea was, well, it's been cleared out for us, so let's go in and upgrade. We can put in roads, we can put in proper amenities, sewer, sanitation. But to do this, residents would have to move into temporary shelter while the land's being rebuilt. Now, if you put yourself in that situation and imagine what tension that causes for you, if I leave to a temporary tent somewhere else or move in with a friend, will my land still be there when I come back? Because nobody in informal settlements, this part of Imizamo Yetu is very informal, called Danseyake, nobody has land tenure or title deeds or any proof at all that they actually had a right to be living there or even were living there. So to leave is a huge risk. And people didn't really trust the city and the state at that point because they hadn't developed projects in the past and things they promised had not come to fruition. So there was fear about leaving. But then on the other hand, they were told, you'll get a developed neighborhood to live in, and there may even be jobs because we'll employ you to help with the building. And so there was this balance that people had to place. What they did is they spoke to their community leaders, their committee leaders. Informal settlements are really governed through committees, and they play such an important role. Almost all the committees said, move, let them do the developments and move out, except one. And that one committee was able to derail the entire process. Because once they said to their collection of supporters, no guys, we're going to rebuild, and they started to rebuild, it had a domino effect. Everybody came straight back. It was too fearful because you were now going to lose your land. So when we returned years later, and the consequence of that, by the way, was more than just the land. I mean, in the end, the conflict between these committees and residents ended up with the ANC branch office being burnt down, the ANC leaders being literally burnt out of the suburb, and then ongoing related widespread protests. So if you live in Hout Bay and wondered why the roads were always being blocked with protests, it was related to this. So years later, when we've returned, we can see there's been little progress. And when we went and asked one leader, what's happened here? They don't even have electricity at all, and they used to have it before the fire. She said, well, recently we had the City of Cape Town come in to try and put in electricity. But the committee that didn't want this to happen called up the city and said, you take your men out, or we will take them out in body bags. So you can see what that means is that how a city is made, how a neighborhood is formed, is not up to the state alone. Committees have a lot of power. And ultimately what it showed us was that you can have the best technical processes, you can have really good urban planning on paper, but if you can't resolve contestation over land and access to services and work with the groups that exist on the ground, nothing is going to happen. So yes, the City of Cape Town provided some disaster relief options, and that was helpful, but the residents' responses ultimately were determined by these competing local leaders who were embedded within community structures and had different pulls and different rationales. So that was the first crisis that we researched. Then came COVID, and I'm sure everybody here remembers that. You know, I think I might be a bit of an anomaly because I actually really enjoyed lockdown because we were driving home the day lockdown was announced. The day after we were told, right, you've got all locked down. And we were driving back home. And I think it must have been during the recess because I remember looking and thinking, oh, this is a crisis. You know you're a researcher when you get excited by disaster. But I was like, oh, this is a crisis we can research in real time. We know it's going to happen. We can see it. We've got a few weeks to prepare. And so we did. I spoke to my colleague again, Esther Cooper-Knox. She was able to get the money from the UK. We had some amazing students and researchers, Meli Dube, Botamela Papane, and Mfundo Manjola. And we came together and we designed this project, what we called the Lockdown Diaries. And we were even able to get ethics clearance in 4 days. True miracle. So we devised this novel method. And what we did is we used WhatsApp. And it really was novel. We've never found anyone else who'd done this before. But we used WhatsApp to send diary prompts to 70 people across the city for nearly 4 months. And we had a diversity of different age groups, race, gender, income groups. So we were able to get a really good mix. And we asked them questions about how they were responding to lockdown in real time. We asked them everything about what the regulations meant, how they felt about not being able to exercise. Anything that happened, we would ask them 3 times a week. We learned a lot of very interesting things, actually, from this research. I mean, one of the key things was that the burden of care placed on women in the home during lockdown across the city was so disproportionate. We also found out that so many of our respondents really supported the alcohol ban, and the biggest change in their life came from that, and that was not a finding we expected. But we also learned a lot about the erratic and harsh treatment from police, and many different aspects of the lockdown. And thus we published all of this analysis, not in academic journals actually, but in newspaper articles across the city and across the country and also in the UK as well. So then this work on lockdown, we continued thinking about crisis and COVID. And I started to work with other colleagues, Melanie Lombard at the University of Sheffield and Carlos Tovar at the University of Javeriana in Cali in Colombia. And we were lucky to get a grant from the Urban Studies Foundation. And we explored there how community-based organizations, how CBOs in these 2 highly unequal cities, Cali and Cape Town are in the top 5 murder rates in the world, and also top 5 unequal cities in the world. So really interesting comparison between them. And we explored here, how did people in real time, community organizations, actually respond, and how were they able to provide both digital inclusion, access through digital means to education, care, and food. And after 12 months of doing qualitative research in both cities, we also used our digital diaries there as well, we could show that CBAs were able to supplement the state, that they built partnerships, that they were able to do what the academics call boundary spanning. They were able to move beyond the smaller networks that they'd always had, form new networks, go outside of their boundaries. They acted as mediators and brokers, and they were able to leverage their trust-based networks to support resilience in these neighborhoods. We found them to be incredibly effective first responders in times of crisis. But the problem was that this was a short-lived reality, because without state partnership, in other words, shared governance that included the state, the potential for longer-term, systemic, equitable resilience was very limited. So we started to develop the idea from this of hybridizing governance to show how actually state and society in times of crisis need to work together. We need to think about how they're interconnected and how they mesh. We've continued this research more recently through understanding, let me pause on that. Through understanding governance and crisis, we were lucky to be funded by the British Academy on this new project. Same team, same 2 cities, but we added another 2 cities. We added Johannesburg and Buenaventura in Colombia. And we used storytelling as our main research method. So through a series of workshops, asking participants, residents of low-income areas, what does crisis mean to you, and how do you respond to crisis? We helped people to facilitate the production of these stories, which shall play in one moment. Okay. Yeah, there's no sound, but I just want to show you the images. So we produced 19 collective stories, 45 community participants, and they did storybooks, they did podcasts, they did videos. We interviewed local and national government officials as well to kind of benchmark what we were finding. And the stories were very diverse on the one hand. But on the other hand, we saw such key similarities across these areas. Communities emphasized economic inequality, the lack of opportunities, violence, and poor service delivery as their key concerns in these 4 areas. And it was clear that local urban crisis couldn't be understood without looking at deep connection between inequality and violence, and both of these things had been shaped by the history of these specific places. So these forces influence how communities and local governments can, or indeed cannot, respond effectively to crisis. And we also found that official accounts of crisis are often driven by powerful interests, and they frame crisis as a short-term disruption to services. If we can just fix the services, there won't be a crisis anymore. But actually what our research has shown is that it's much deeper than that crises are layered, they're structural. And the moment that you have one structural challenge, maybe it's unemployment, you're far more likely to have a longer-term systemic crisis because of that first structural inequality that you're dealing with. So crises we found for all of the participants we were talking to were actually ongoing, and they were very different to disaster. Even though all the interviews with officials in all of the cities loved to use the word disaster and never wanted to use the word crisis, because a disaster you can respond to in real time, and a crisis requires quite significant structural change. But one of the other things that came out of these stories was that they show a really grounded sense of hope. And I am a bit of I do drink a lot of the happy juice. I like to think optimistically, how can we be positive? And so, the paper I'm writing, my colleagues are writing on the stress of the violence and inequality, but I'm writing a paper about hope right now. Because all of the stories had some element of hope to them. Hope where people could see possibilities, where they'd stay in a place and make it work, or they'd move somewhere else for new opportunities, they'd create a new home, they would draw on their networks, they'd organize collectively in their neighborhood or city. So we are hoping now, we've just come to the end of this research, that these participant stories will be valuable to the state to help them understand how should you actually respond to disaster when you think of it as a crisis. I'm now going to move to thinking about and talking about service delivery. And yes, I am going to, friends and family, talk about toilets, because that's what I do. They laugh at me all the time. You studied for all these years to just research toilets. But I love toilets, okay. Shouldn't we all? But I'm sure for all of us, for so many years, I had no idea about the wonderful world of toilets. Like most people, I flushed, I didn't think about it. You don't want to think about it, it must just go away. But what happens if you're less privileged and you actually don't have access to a toilet or to reliable sanitation? So I was fortunate to be invited to join this great team of researchers from all around the world. It was 7 or 8 different universities, and we were working in 4 cities. We were looking at Lima in Peru, Cape Town, Nairobi in Kenya, and we did research Cap Haitian and Haiti, but we couldn't go there in the end because, you can't travel there. And what we were really trying to understand is this question of, can off-grid sanitation be a solution to the sanitation problem in low-income settlements? Because sanitation systems are largely invisible, but they are crucial to dignity, health, and well-being. And it may surprise you to know that only 47% of the world's urban population have safely managed sanitation. In other words, only 47% of people actually have human waste that is treated before it is disposed. And so what happens when you don't have that? That's what happens. You have to use off-grid options. This is obviously an extreme version. Actually, the colloquial term is flying toilets, but you don't have an option of a dignified solution. So the city of Cape Town and many other, as far as we're aware, the city of Cape Town is one of maybe 2 or 3 cities in the world that provides free service sanitation to its residents in informal settlements. And their solution has been off-grid toilets like these. They're called porta potties, or these are chemical toilets, these kind of examples. And the idea is that this should transform sanitation solutions. It's cost effective and you can service easily. The City of Cape Town provides nearly 40,000 types of container-based sanitation. So our question for the study was, should container-based sanitation be scaled up as a solution to the sanitation challenge in informal settlements? And it seemed like Cape Town was going to provide that answer, that we would find, yes, look how Cape Town have done it, and everybody now has great toilets. But actually, what we found, and just to say how we did the research, we did two things. We did all the usual interviews. All of our research is always interviews, but we did two other things. Firstly, we did a smartphone survey, which was very interesting because we were working in Khayelitsha, we gave 100 residents in Khayelitsha a smartphone. And every week, they had to input answers to a survey question that would pop up on their phone. I do not recommend that as a research method. It is so deeply problematic and incredibly difficult to manage, but the UK partners thought it would work really well. Anyway, we did do it, and I'm proud of it, but never again. The other thing we did was we did Photovoice. And Photovoice, all the images I'm showing you here are from people who've taken pictures with disposable cameras we gave them of their own lived reality. And so we were able then to share what their story is. And so what our research ultimately found was that there are really conflicted views in relation to toilets, and that the way people experience these toilets is also deeply entwined with their experiences and the promises, or the unmet promises, of the post-apartheid state. People had expected decent sanitation because that's what they'd been promised. And this is not decent sanitation. So at face value, it looks fine. But the reality is that it's not dignified. If you can imagine you have that toilet, where do you put it if you're living in a shack that is 6 meters by 6 meters? You can't put it next to your bed. Where is it going to go? So now you need extra space, but there isn't any extra space. So then you have to find extra space. You have to build a structure. And in finding extra space, you're going to come into conflict with your neighbors because they don't want your toilet next to their bedroom window. So toilets are very political. And so when we see these images of vandalized toilets, it is not because people are deliberately breaking toilets. It's because either they could not get access, because the other thing that happens is if you can't get that toilet near you, then you will have to share a toilet. And these shared toilets, you can see here, they've got locks on them. People who have power in the community put the locks on the toilets. And if you're not one of those people, you don't get access to a toilet. How might you respond to your neighbor? Well, you might just break their door down because you're a little bit cross about that, so you can go and use the toilet. So you can see that this is the question of sanitation is a deeply political question of governance and power and control. I mean, ultimately what we found and what we explained to the city is that the technical solution to toilets, you can build the best toilet ever. They've got, the Gates Foundation spends a lot of money on building the best technical toilet, and we keep telling them that's not going to solve the problem. And they do realize that now because it hasn't solved the problem. But what we found is that actually you've got to think about where's the dignity in the space in order to have a dignified toilet. And ultimately, that becomes a question of land tenure. Because just like for any of us, you need a sewer plugged into the land in which you're staying to flush your waste away. But if you have no access to that land, and you're not, no access to have that land forever, and you're not being able to be told you can own this, and where you live, you're told is a temporary structure, there's no incentive or no legal ability to build a sewered network in informal settlements. So the question of toilets is actually the question of land tenure, which is a deeply political question that relates to the history of our country as well. So now I'm going to talk about water and energy. So in 2021, I started to think about water and energy because we'd all had day zero, I can remember that, and then we'd all been living through solar panels and through load shedding. So what happens when a city can't provide its services? And we know about day zero, why that happened in Cape Town, but Johannesburg often has water shortages for reasons that have nothing to do with drought. So again, it's all about access, governance, management. So we started to look at this question of what happens when wealthier citizens go off-grid. So at the same time I was researching toilets off-grid, we were looking at wealthy citizens going off-grid. What happens to planning and governance in municipalities when significant numbers of their ratepayers install boreholes and solar panels, And what does this tell us about the role of the state and the social contract, which is a fancy way of saying how we as citizens believe the state should treat us and how we should treat the state? What is our contract, our social contract between us and the state? So what happens to that when the state no longer controls, nor can they provide key services? We then did some follow-up work, and the same team is exploring how municipalities can support the idea of a just urban transition. And now we're looking at water and energy provision in low-income settlements, and we're looking specifically at small enterprises, because the small business clinic. And we are looking at how car washes, hair salons, ECD centers, and eateries, how do they actually access water and energy, and how sustainable are their practices? And my own focus in this research is not so much about the water and energy, but about who are the people that control access and the costs of running a small business. So we're conducting research now as well, looking not just at officials, but also at local power holders like gang leaders who run exploitative protection schemes and ultimately stop the scaling up of any business. So I'm going to reflect on 3 lessons about urban governance before I turn to thinking about how this all relates to the question of democracy. So the 3 lessons that have come to me from this research are firstly that it is clear that in the face of decreasing state capabilities, citizens are filling the service provision gap with their own solutions. And this, to a significant extent, means that they are governing themselves. And what's so fascinating from an academic point of view is that this happens across the socioeconomic spectrum. Most academic research talks about the poor having to provide their own services and calls it informality. And they don't really look about what happens when the wealthy provide their own services, because that's just acceptable. So what we're saying is actually, no, this happens across the whole spectrum. And informality is not the right term to be thinking about it. So we use the term and the idea of state substitution relating to that of shifting sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is the political term that means that the state has the supreme authority to govern itself without external influence. And so one of the arguments we're making is that the state no longer has its sovereignty because it can't govern its own services, and it's not able to provide the control about how, when, where, and who provides services. So we think this offers a less binary analytical lens. So in other words, what we're saying is that the ways in which citizens supplement and they substitute for the state contests and it renegotiates spaces of sovereignty. And what's been interesting about the research we've done is that we see that the state responds to this substitution of services in very different ways. Mostly it's just inaction. It just turns a blind eye. Can't do much about it, we'll pretend it's not going on. Sometimes there is negotiation and permissive space granted. We see what you're doing, we accept it, okay, a trade-off. But very rarely are we seeing repression. People are not being penalized. I'm not sure if people here even know that if you have a borehole or solar power, you're meant to register it, and it's illegal not to, but there's no punishment if you don't. Yet, oh, I shouldn't say that, hey? Tempting fate. The political impact of the state substitution, I think, is what is really important to require deeper reflection, because it's happening under our noses. There was an article today in the Daily Maverick about how citizen groups are basically managing services in the city of Cape Town. They're building roads. I mean, in the city of Johannesburg, sorry. They're putting in, filling potholes. They're governing Johannesburg. And we're not asking, what does this mean in terms of the role of the state? And the longer term questions, again, about the social contract. What do we expect of the state and what happens in return? Okay, so then the second reflection I'd like to make is that while this is happening, citizens are not doing this entirely cut off from the state. That actually the city may not be sovereign, but local residents, committees, organizing groups, they are not all powerful either, and that they need the state for service delivery. And in fact, not only do they need the state, but most of the residents in all the research we've done, people actually want the state. They don't want to have to provide their own services. And even when they protest, actually we wrote a paper called Defiant Citizenship, because what we were arguing was that even when people are protesting and it looks like they're fighting the state, they're actually just fighting for the state to come and do something and do what they ask. So it's not an act of anarchy. So the argument that I'd like to make here is that we need to think about the reality of a concept that I'm calling hybridizing governance. That and that this works at multiple scales, that governance is hybridized. It's a mix of 2 or 3 different actors, often many more, but a mix of hybrid parts coming together to run the ways and the cities in which we live. I mean, if you just think about the idea of installing solar panels, for example, you can install and buy a solar panel, but it won't work if you don't connect it to the grid. And so you need the state, because you need the state's grid if you want reliable, unless you're living somewhere very remote, but almost all people who have solar panels are somehow going to connect to the grid. Unless you've got a massive battery system and you can make that work, you need the grid for 24-hour electricity. So that is a hybrid electricity solution. Again, what we saw about the fire in Imozamayetu, the city on its own couldn't respond to the fire. The residents on their own couldn't respond to the fire. And you needed to have that, and there was a hybridized governance happening. But I do want to note that this form of hybridized governance is very different from the models of collaborative governance or networked or co-production, which is used a lot in the literature about shared governance. Because those terms, they refer to multi-stakeholders working together that have been deliberative, collective decision-making, they've planned, they've come together, they've made, come up with plans to address service delivery before a crisis happens. But in South Africa, our form of hybridizing governance is actually just a workaround after the fact. There are attempts to find a new way of accessing delivering services in spite of, not because of, existing policy design and implementation. So, the third takeaway is, given this reality of hybridized governance, it is absolutely vital for politicians and government officials to understand the complex politics of local neighborhoods before they implement a plan. Because if you impose a development plan without accepting the reality that it's going to be a hybrid process of governing, it's most likely not going to work. And you really can't enter a settlement at a critical moment without grasping the dynamics that could end up destabilizing an area and making it worse off than it was before. So we have to accept that South Africa's policymaking, particularly at the urban scale, is designed around an outdated assumption. And that assumption is that the state is able to provide all services to all citizens as legislated by the Constitution. But this is not the case. And so instead, I would argue that the state needs to work with the grain, acknowledge everyday hybridized governance, and then find ways that are realistic to support more sustainable service delivery. So now I'm going to turn, and you'll be happy to know, it's my last point, we're coming to the end, to the idea of what does all of this mean for democracy? Because I am actually at heart a scholar of democracy, and it sounds like I'm just an urban studies scholar. But actually, to me, the big question is, we have this process happening of how the cities actually run. But how do they link to and work with our formal democratic structures? So the way a state governs a health crisis, or how it delivers basic services, all of this happens under the legal framework of a democracy. And this is a moral framework as well. It's an ideology. It doesn't come from the heavens. We've chosen this as our ideology that we want to live under. So how do we make these forms of governance and democracy work? Yeah, there's our constitution. These are just pictures to do with protest and coming together. But this is what I wanted to show, that in South Africa we have formal democratic structures for participation, but they only go as far as the ward level. And a ward is actually a very big area. So you can see here, again, forgive me for always using Hout Bay, it's just a useful example. But you can see Hout Bay there, it has multiple neighborhoods. It goes as far up almost into Camps Bay. And yet if you live in an individual neighborhood, the only way you can be formally represented is at that ward scale. So how do we have to think about what we work with below the ward scale? Now, we do have a rich set of legislated opportunities for engagement with the state between elections, which supports the idea of participatory democracy, and these are, board committee meetings, etc. But they're too often tick box exercises. But I would still argue, even though we have these challenges with democratic representation and participatory democracy is not working the way it should, that we don't have a crisis of democracy. We actually have a crisis of governance in South Africa. So the challenge is, though, that when transparent and accountable governance is eroded, when the state can't deliver basic services, it hurts democracy because citizens become disconnected from the formal system. They don't turn out to vote because they can't see their democratic act of voting translating into accountable governance. So they associate the failure of governance with the failure of democracy. But I think in practice that the daily acts of hybridized governance that I've described and that we all engage in actually offer the potential for a form of what I would call, and colleagues we're working with would call, participatory patchwork democracy. Because citizens, in essence, are claiming civic space and they're representing their interests. They're not trying to be anarchic. They're not trying to move away from the state. They're trying to work with the state, and they're trying to do that in ways that have many democratic ethos, like representation, articulation. And so it's important because democratic processes need to link these formal structures to these informal ways of governing. And this is why I'd say we need to learn from hybridized governance and informal representation, committee work, etc., and weave them into conversation with formal democratic processes. We need to think of these democratic patches as spaces where informal and formal systems and democratic practice will intersect. And we also have to be aware, though, that while these patches, when they mesh with one another or connect with formal systems, can and sometimes do provide systematic democratic processes, there are also times where they can erode democracy. And that's because the one thing that the state should and could and must do is govern to ensure equality. That ultimately is a fundamental role of the state. It can make sure that interests are aggregated, that everybody is treated as equally as possible. And when you are an individual group or resident or citizen trying to argue and fight for your own services, you're really not going to worry about your neighbor. So that's why you do still need the state. So, to conclude, the argument I'm putting forward today is that we need to better understand in our academic research, in our policy-making practices, the relationship between spaces for democratic engagement and how the state can work together with citizens. And this requires new transdisciplinary research. And that's basically a fancy word in academia for saying we can't just have different disciplines doing their things separately and talking to each other. We need to actually find ways of crossing over these disciplines, working integrated ways and learning from and with each other. And I think that the two key frameworks I would argue we need to really bring together are frameworks from urban geography, where they do excellent work in terms of thinking through how governance actually works in the city, but with political scientists who are asking questions about the social contract, democracy, sovereignty. And this is an area in which I hope to, alongside the wonderful students I work with and with our politics and urban governance research group, to continue to take a transdisciplinary approach. And we try very hard to actually do this, where we combine research and engagement with policymakers and local communities to deepen our understanding of urban governance, and really importantly, to think about how do we protect democratic space. One of the ways we're increasingly doing this is through participatory action research, so these methods like Photovoice and storytelling. And they are such great research processes, not only because they support non-academics to tell their own stories with their own images in their own words, but because they're really powerful tools for influencing policymaking. So a brief example is the work we've done with Khayelitsha in the city of Cape Town. Basically, the city of Cape Town said, we know we're not servicing Khayelitsha properly. And there's a perception in Cape Town that informal settlements don't get as good service delivery, they don't get things fixed as quickly as you do, and they don't, it's true, as if you live in a formal neighborhood. Why is that the case? Because residents in Khayelitsha, a year of research told us, residents in Khayelitsha don't log complaints when things break. If their toilets break, their waters break, they don't log a complaint. Whereas if we're living in a formal settlement, we just email, WhatsApp, whatever way, but it's simple, and I can tell you from experience, they can get to your house before you can get home from work to fix whatever's broken. So how do you fix that? Well, the city had one idea. They were going to just print stickers about what numbers to call to fix the services. So we were able to show them that's probably not going to work, but us telling them wasn't good enough. Instead, we brought the residents together. We had a whole day's workshop with the mayor, MECs, officials, and they created their own solution, working in small teams, presenting ideas they thought would work, and then voting on them. And ultimately, the residents voted with the officials for a solution that had nothing to do with the city's plan. That plan didn't even get a single vote. But the other plans got votes. And in a recent conversation with the MEC of Water and Sanitation, they're going to give it a try. They're going into Khayelitsha and they're trying a new approach by getting local residents to actually service their own basic infrastructure where they have the skills. So it's that approach to thinking about praxis, bringing theory and action together, and that's the direction I'm hoping that my work will continue in the future. I cannot, of course, conclude the lecture without the most important part, and that is a vote of thanks. You know, in academia, we are recognized, and you stand up here as an individual. And as my family will know, I found this deeply uncomfortable to do this, actually, because we don't work as individuals. And it creates the misleading impression that the research we do, or the teaching we design, or the community outreach, or the professional leadership, and even the committees we sit on are all individual efforts. But they really are not. In truth, nothing I have spoken about today, or the achievements that supported my promotion to professorship, were created on my own. I am firstly the product of a supportive and loving family, with parents, sorry, I'm just so touched because they actually came to join me today, and they don't live in Cape Town, who genuinely believed I could achieve whatever I wanted and created a nurturing environment for me to do so. And I have a wonderful extended family and my siblings, my nieces, my nephews, and a group of the most loyal and wonderful friends. And also fiercely intelligent friends, great people to talk to. Sometimes I wouldn't mind just, lying on the couch on a Saturday night. I've also been lucky to cross paths with and join projects with an incredible group of academics, mostly from across the world, not even in South Africa, so many of them. And so I do want to say a brief shout out just to a few people amongst many, but S.J. Cooper-Knock, Paul Grady, Charlotte Lemansky, Melanie Lombard, Anna M.D., and Margot Rubin for collaborating on the projects I've just spoken about, providing academic friendship, but they've really also just made work fun. I enjoy working because we have a good time together. At UWC, I have found a department that is incredibly caring. If I had to use one word to sum up our department, it would be caring. Because we do create space for each other to do our research, but we always put the student first. And thank you for the leadership to my department for inculcating those values, sometimes to our detriment. So thank you, Cheryl, Yulene, Linda Kukle, Misha, Nadia, Ashley, Marcel, and Ayanda. I hope we work together until we're all old and grey. I'm also very grateful to the postgraduate students I've supervised and the undergraduates I have taught. The theory says I'm meant to teach you, but this has been a two-way street, and I have learned just as much from working with all of you over the years. And thank you so much to those of you who are here that I can see today. I'm also really fortunate, and there's some pictures of my colleagues here, to work in the EMS faculty. I really love this diverse faculty that, it accommodates accountants alongside abstract political theorists. And somehow we make it all work and we come together. And my colleagues have shared so many hours of committee meetings, but they've done it with a committed work ethic, and most importantly, a really strong commitment to social justice and thinking about equality and how to help our students. 3 years ago, we started the Politics and Urban Governance Research Group, and that's us up there on the right-hand side. And I have been so happy to see this group go from strength to strength. So thank you to Michaelan, to Melly, to Tina, Babangile, Neo, Botamela, and Sandisa for the passion you bring to what we do. And it really isn't always easy work. In fact, it's almost always hard work, challenging work, let me put it that way. It's complicated work. And then last but not least, it's hard to find words to do justice to my amazing immediate family. Oh, you guys put up with so much. To my husband, Damien, and my children, Dave and Ella. You are in equal parts graciously tolerant of my constant talking about work. But you are also just so thoughtful in your everyday reflections on what I share. I have been blessed beyond what any one person should expect to have in their life. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Wow. I must say, you took me along it was interesting to meet little Fiona and to be taken on your journey. And I think you're a gifted storyteller. I think using Photovoice is something that you do, but the way that you tell your story and distill it and make complexity simple. I think because we are all kind of different specialities, a different audience, and I think everybody could hang on your lips and could just be taken along with what you told. I think I had a couple of light bulb moments from also my work in communities thinking, I need to go and talk to Fiona about that. You know what? I've also felt that, but I don't have the background. But that comes again to this whole transdisciplinary focus that we need to move towards, especially if we're doing these complex work that you are doing. I'm now going to ask Prof. Tapscott to come to respond to the lecture. Thanks, Prof.
Good evening, everyone. Wow, I don't know if you really need a response after that presentation, but it does give me great pleasure to be able to reflect on Professor Anciano's inaugural lecture and reflect on the body of her work, academic work as a whole. And as her presentation this evening has indicated, she's focusing on one of the most profound challenges facing South Africa and indeed most of the world at the moment, and namely that is how to make democracy meaningful to ordinary citizens, and especially the poor, who have become increasingly distrustful of democratic systems and, as the polls reveal, increasingly refuse in great numbers to participate in electoral processes. And we also know that this has created a political vacuum, and we are witnessing the rise of right-wing populism and autocratic rule, which threatens the very foundations of democracy globally. Notwithstanding this threat, as a point of departure, or maybe actually came towards the end of it, but I took it as a point of departure, she asserts that we don't have a crisis of democracy in the country, but rather a crisis of governance. Now, here it is important to note that the meaning of governance has different understandings for different people, and in its initial conceptualization, it is attributed to a World Bank report published in the late 1980s. And in this, good governance referred to a range of activities: accountability, transparency, efficiency, the rule of law, and other supposed attributes of effective administration, which were set as preconditions, actually, for the allotment of development aid. And in this formulation, governance was very much something which was carried out by central governments and in pursuit of a normative end. And this normative end was normally one from the global north. Developing countries had to aspire to the good governance that you'd have in Europe. And it was often defined more by its absence than its presence. However, the conceptualization that Professor Anciano has given us today is a more expansive one, and she has gone into that in great detail, because it encompasses the different ways in which communities self-organize when confronted by a failing state. And sadly, it is no secret that local government in South Africa is in crisis. And this is confirmed by President Ramaphosa in his State of the Nation address in 2023, when he stated, "Too many of our municipalities, 163 out of 257, which is 63%, are dysfunctional or in distress due to poor governance, ineffective and sometimes corrupt financial and administrative management, and poor service delivery. So it's in this context that we measure how citizens engage with the local state. And at the same time, although we have these very formal systems of participatory government, we have the architecture for it. Numerous studies have pointed out that the system as a whole is failing. And poor communities often resort to protests, and it was alluded to that, as a form of engagement with the state, because they feel that is the only way they're going to be heard is through protest, because the actual participatory processes themselves do not function. And there have been repeated attempts to reform local government. I can count in recent research, I've been doing at least 5 attempts, and there's one currently under the way at the moment to try and reorganize local government. But thus far they have failed because they have not succeeded to listening to the expressed needs of local people, which are often lost in reports produced by ward councils, either because they're not written or they're not submitted, or sometimes they just go into the rubbish bin. Integrated development plans often do not reflect the needs of people. And so on with other forms of formal governance processes. So for a lot of people, participatory processes simply do not work. And this is at just the center of what the point that you're making, that citizens are now looking at new ways of engagement and new forms of participation. And in highly dualistic societies, and South Africa is a highly dualistic society, there's a deep disjuncture between the formalistic elements of good governance and deeply embedded social and cultural practices which exist in communities. And you've highlighted that in your work in Imizama Yetu and in other contexts as well. There are different ways of doing things and different understandings of what governance is. And a consequence of this, and the point was made very strongly, people frequently feel disconnected from formal democratic processes, and they resort to their own informal norms and practices of government, which, as you say, may include patronage and clientelism. But while some of these elements of traditional governance may be considered undemocratic, her research reveals that some forms of informal governance produce positive outcomes. And you gave the example of the COVID pandemic, where citizen-based organizations were first-line responders, and also, very importantly, surfaced the understanding that the COVID crisis itself in poor communities had a far longer history behind it. Poor access to health, overcrowding, informality of different sorts contributed to the spread of the disease. And your point that came out of your research is to say these are not short-term problems. These are not disasters. They're more structural, more deep-seated crises that need to be addressed. And taking that by an extension, COVID has come to an end, but the next virus that comes along will produce similar types of outcomes because we haven't addressed the root problems. But your point made was that the communities themselves surface these problems. The focus on what you term hybridized forms of governance, to my mind, represents a step beyond the idea of mutually exclusive, invited and created spaces of citizen engagement advanced by Andrea Cornwall and others at the Institute of Development Studies. By invited spaces, the terminology was there that a ward committee is a place where people are invited to participate. But then when people don't get satisfied, they create their own spaces, which may be protest actions or some form of activity that will organize themselves, not in the formal structures. Because your idea, I think, opens up the possibility of community-based organizations collaborating with the local state, because the exclusivity of invited and created spaces suggests that this isn't possible. And I like the notion of democratic patches, where informal and formal systems of governance can come together. I think that is a very innovative conceptualization. And in a sense, it envisages what the scholar Merrily Grindle spoke about as good enough governance, which focus on key aspects of governance which might feasibly be achieved within the political and administrative realities of a specific time and place. The trouble is often the system of government we are trying to pursue is an ideal, and it often is not suited to the circumstances of most of our communities. And this is also builds on the work of David Booth, Tim Kensel, and others from the Overseas Development Institute in their Africa Power and Politics program, which argues that there is a need for local states to recognize and support these new forms of governance. Don't see them as an aberration. Work with them. We spoke about the notion of working with the grain. But I'll take one example. Our building regulations in this country are extremely strict. If you go to any country to the north of here, and you'll see people building houses one room at a time. And they'll progressively build up to a full house. And all along the way, there'll be value chains of people building, making bricks, making window frames, making door frames, and building. We don't allow that. So in some senses, by this really strict form of building regulations, we strip people of their own agency. We don't allow them to actually use their own talents to do this. I was also very impressed that your idea of research very much embodies the notion that the personal is political. And the study of local democracy is not, in the first instance, about political activities at the macro level, about the rise and form of different political parties, about intergovernmental relations challenges, but rather it is about the lived experiences of everyday life amongst the urban poor. Issues which might sometimes seem mundane to some. High-flying political scientists may not want to go there, but access to toilet facilities, to water, electricity, and social services profoundly affect the quality of life of poor households. And importantly, they also shape their views about democracy and what the expected dividends, if any, might be from democracy. And you probably heard this saying before, you can't eat democracy. Well, I could say crude things about what democracy in toilets, but I won't. I was also very impressed by the innovative measures that you have used to engage in your research. You mentioned some of them: participatory action research, storytelling, smartphones, etc. Because it gives voice to people, and it gives them an opportunity to express their own views about what the livelihoods they're living in, which is not filtered through an academic lens. So in a sense, you're getting sometimes the raw opinions, the raw voice of people who are suffering under these circumstances. I'm also very impressed by the fact that you and your colleagues have not been content to merely document events at the local level, but have also assumed a role as advocates for change. And most academics evaluate the impact of their publications according to the number of citations they've received, but would give very little thought to the impact of the research that they've done. However, I think you have made important steps in trying to bridge the disconnect between theory and praxis, as you mentioned, by getting together the mayor of Cape Town with citizens in Khayelitsha to talk about practical issues and to elicit their views on possible solutions. And here I can get back to what I'm saying about the failure of our existing participatory systems. They are supposed to be doing this, but they haven't been because of a very formalized way we go about these things. And some research I did some years ago with a colleague in Metsimaholo, Old Sasolburg, with I think maybe 2% of the population speak English. The IDP is in English. And it is lodged in the local library for those who can read, speak English, or even read, or even have a library ticket. So this formalistic nature of participatory processes is something obviously that you are looking to try and work through. What did shine through for me in your presentation is your enthusiasm as a teacher and your very strong commitment to inspire students to make sense of the complex political realm that we live in today. And also to engage young people in the very important work that you're doing in the Politics and Urban Governance Research Group, PUG. Do you own a PUG? I just wondered. And also to acknowledge the work that they're doing and to affirm the work that they're doing in the research that you are engaged in. And secondly, I'm looking at your CV, highly impressed at the extent of your networking, both nationally and internationally. And these have opened up opportunities for both comparative and transdisciplinary research, both of which are key for key components for the development of theory, that you don't focus on just one locality and one topic. So yeah, I think that is a very important one. I might also add that Professor Anciano has been a very, very successful fundraiser in a very, very difficult funding climate at the moment. It is not easy to raise funding with all the constraints going on in the world. So in conclusion, Fiona, I'd like to congratulate you on your appointment to the chair of Citizenship and Democracy. I have absolutely no doubt that you'll continue to produce high-quality research in this position, that you'll continue to elevate the status of PUG, and in so doing, you will play an important role in UWC's goal of becoming a research-led university. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. I think you just deepened the insights and you gave me an additional level or additional layer to now reflect on. Thanks a lot for being here with us this evening. I'm now going to call my colleague, Prof. Christy Swanepoel, to do a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Caro. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all participants for being here, both in person and online. As an economist, I understand the concept of opportunity cost, and I value that you are here and have offered up your time. I will now go down my list. It is quite an extensive list, so please bear with me as well. If I missed anyone inadvertently, my apologies, and please forgive me. So first of all, to our wonderful cleaning staff, not only the staff here tonight, but also the EMS staff in general. We recently and unexpectedly lost one of our EMS cleaners, Ms. Nomkumbuzu Ndiki, and we share the grief of the cleaning team and her family. Your tireless work and dedication do not go unnoticed. To our caterers, thank you for feeding us and often for feeding our souls as much as you feed our bodies. To the security staff, thank you for standing firm and for keeping us safe. As a female, I promise I am fully aware of the sacrifices you make, and I appreciate it. To the medics here, in case of emergency, I didn't even know we had medics here. We hope we don't need to call on you, but thank you for your service and the comfort you bring being here. To our wonderful photographer tonight, please remember, only best side. To the team of media specialists, including the audiovisual team there at the back, the media office and the institutional advancement office, thank you for helping with the presentation tonight and for ensuring the message reaches far and wide. In the faculty, I would like to thank Mr. Rinquest, don't see him here, for all the reminders and encouragement. as well as for the professional and support staff. If I mention all the professional and support staff, we'll be here until dawn, but to Stephanie, Melissa, Sibu, and Shanaz particularly, thank you. To our Dean, Professor Isu, thank you for your time and support. You are always gracious and kind, and we appreciate it. To the other deans, thank you as well for offering your time and the support. To the Department of Political Studies, Prof Africa and her team, the department's support and hard work ultimately offer the support to reach these milestones. To Professor Caro van den Berg for your time and keeping the program in line. Without you, we'd all be sitting when we should be standing and standing when we should be sitting. To Professor Franz, since acting as Deputy Dean in April, I've only gotten a small inclination and small glimmer of your diary and what it must look like. As a representative for the faculty, thank you. You've offered up valuable time, and we appreciate it. May I also ask you to convey our thanks to the rest of the senior management team, particularly Professor Balfour, who we know worked in the background to ensure this inaugural series. Professor Tapscott, thank you for your words and insights that you've offered. I know Fiona has learned much from you and appreciates the mentorship and support. To Fiona's family, thank you for being here tonight. It's an absolute privilege to see you here. I'm sure there were late night complaints about reviewer 2, and frustration with the writing that we didn't see. We share in your pride in her achievements, and we celebrate that here with you tonight. Finally, to Fiona, well done on this milestone. Thank you for all the hard work and inspiration that you've contributed to the department, the faculty, the university, and the community at large. The hard work has shown and borne fruit. To me, you are a great source of inspiration, and I look forward to meeting you often and working with you in the upcoming years. Thank you. Can we give one round of applause again for Fiona? So, as you would have seen, there is a small gift that Professor Isu will now present to Fiona. Thank you again, everyone. We are now closing, so may I ask that all attendees please stand and allow the academic procession to leave the hall first.